Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Meteorologist John Homenuk with Empire Weather. Here with an update on the long-range weather conditions across the United States. It is a busy and important couple of weeks coming up here, specifically as it relates to agriculture here across the United States. Quiet morning across a large majority of the central United States. You'll see that on visible satellite we have a broad area of pleasant weather encompassing a large majority of the agriculture belt this morning. That's all thanks to this low pressure system. You see this cold front that's draped down here throughout the eastern U.S. and then this cooler air driving in behind it. It's not only cooler, but it's also lower humidity. It's actually quite a bit abnormally low humidity for a large majority of this region this morning. We're starting to see a little bit of return of that moisture, but overall, it's a pleasant morning. With the one exception being across the southern plains, this part of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, they'll take this rainfall. And they're going to be the focus over the next couple of days with that rain that we just talked about. So we'll look at the forecast here shortly. Let's back up, though, and check out where we are in terms of precipitation from this weekend. So quite a busy weekend. This is ending on Sunday, so it doesn't capture some additional rains that occurred on Sunday afternoon and evening. But if you look overall, we had quite a bit of rain in areas that needed it. Some heavy precipitation in central and eastern Iowa. Rainfall totals over 2 inches in some of those spots. Additional rains in parts of Illinois. That spread eastward into parts of Indiana, but not all of parts of Indiana. The rainfall definitely got a little more sporadic once you got east of this general corridor, and the showers and storms became a little bit more scattered in nature. Also some rainfall in parts of Kansas. This continued again throughout the weekend. You can see this boundary where these storms formed in the Dakotas and moved on into parts of the eastern Dakotas and northern Minnesota as well throughout the weekend, and then some rainfall in the Texas Panhandle as well. So when you look at this overall and you back up and take a look at what happened, while not everyone got rain, this is a broad area of precipitation that occurred this weekend in areas that needed it, and more notably in areas that models struggle to pick up on. If we go back 7 to 10 days ago, model guidance in general was not showing this possibility of this precipitation. And I think that's an important factor as we move forward into the weather pattern and we look at what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. If we back up and look at this from a hemispheric perspective and we check out the latest sea surface temperature anomalies, not much change to where we were the last time we talked. We still have the La Niña signal. We still have the La Niña forcing in place. You can see this area of cooler waters here across the equatorial Pacific, some reinvigorated cooler waters in the eastern Pacific, and our troughiness, our cooler waters in the Gulf of Alaska still in place. Trade winds still expected to pick up and kind of guiding this continued La Niña forcing here over the next couple of weeks. This is a pretty high confidence forecast. I know we touch on this a lot in our long range videos, but it is sort of kind of beating a dead horse here at some point because it's just, the pattern is in place and it's kind of locked in here for now what is becoming a very important period in agriculture. And we know that we have this general pattern in place with this La Niña forcing. We have this warmer water here in the central Pacific, including areas of waters north of Hawaii, and we have the cooler waters here off the Gulf of Alaska. And this all acts to encourage a pattern that, again, we've talked about for quite some time. When you have the ridging north of Hawaii, you'd get the troughing off the west coast, and that wave pattern eventually does lead to the possibility of ridging here in the central United States. But those patterns come with, obviously, some caveats. And it's not going to be a constant ridge and a constant trough off the Gulf of Alaska. And we're kind of seeing that right now. So let's check out where we are in the weather pattern across the United States. The first thing is you're going to notice over the next couple of days, as we start with this morning, is it's quiet. The only area that we're going to see precipitation really of note for the next 24 to 48 hours is here across parts of southwestern Kansas. They really need that rainfall. They'll take whatever they can get. It doesn't look widespread at all, but it does move off to the south and east, and that'll slide through. Now, Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning, we'll watch some scattered showers and storms developing across the upper Midwest, eastern Minnesota into Wisconsin. Those will shift down southward, and you'll notice that front kind of washes out, right? If this is a strong front, typically you'd expect those showers and storms to continue, but it doesn't. It kind of just washes out through Wednesday and then into Thursday. We'll watch this little feature here in the Gulf of Mexico for parts of Texas, possibly a weak tropical system and some tropical moisture moving up into this region, but nothing overly concerning. And then Wednesday into Thursday, we'll watch another front bring the possibility of some isolated to scattered storms to the upper Midwest. But you'll notice I haven't talked much about the Central Plains or the Ohio Valley in this time frame, and that's because there's really nothing going on. I mean, this area is kind of stuck in between and in a cooler regime initially, and then the storm track is up here into the Canadian prairies. And so the result, what we get from a precipitation standpoint over the next 5 days, is a largely below normal precipitation pattern across almost the entire agriculture belt. The one exception continues to be this monsoon area here in New Mexico, and then the impacts from the tropical system here along the Gulf Coast. But otherwise, this pattern overall over the next 5 days is drier than normal. And then from a temperature perspective, if we look at the next 5 days, a break in the heat. I mean, a lot of areas here are cooler than normal across the Central Plains and the parts of the Ohio Valley, a couple degrees below normal. And then that real cool shot that we've been talking about for several days is noted here in the Canadian prairies as well. Elsewhere, it's kind of a mixed bag. We have some areas of warmer temperatures, but overall, if you look at this whole area in general, there's really not that much widespread anomalous weather occurring at all, other than the fact that when we back it up and look at precipitation for the next 5 days, and even the next 7 days, it's generally a bit drier than normal across the belt. So what's causing that, right? We've talked about this for quite some time. We know the weather pattern. We mentioned, right, just to go back here for a second, this overall pattern continues to support this ridging north of Hawaii, this troughing in the west coast, and then ridging in the central U.S. But the weather pattern does not work in constants. We ebb and flow back and forth, and that's an important thing to consider, right? So as we move forward here and we look at this weather pattern, this is kind of the opposite of what we would expect based on the sea surface temperature configuration here over the next couple of days. We have a large ridge that is built north of Alaska into the Gulf of Alaska here, and then northward into the polar regions. This is known as a negative EPO, negative Eastern Pacific Oscillation. And we talked about this last week. What this does is it takes all this air here, this airflow, and just lodges it down southward into the Canadian prairies and even parts of the central United States. That matches up very well with the pattern that we're seeing. It also encourages a drier northwest flow look to the pattern, right? So you're not drawing in moisture from the Gulf of Mexico or pulling it up from the Gulf of Mexico. You're instead taking, cooler, drier air from these polar regions and bringing it down into the plains. So that's really matching up with this overall pattern that we're seeing over the next 5 days. It makes quite a bit of sense to understand that we're getting this flow in and why the temperatures are below normal during that time frame. And this takes us into the weekend coming up, and you see that this ridge is not really necessarily in a hurry to leave. It's still kind of hanging out, and that could keep this cooler risk around here as we move into the first week of July. Now, as we move beyond that, and this takes us into the middle of the first week of July, the pattern starts to change. So you start to see this ridging here that was pushing up into the polar regions begin to collapse down to the south and east. And that allows our trough to rebuild back into the Gulf of Alaska. This is a standing feature. We expect it to return. And that's going to push and allow this ridging here to return back into the central United States. And it also is going to encourage the possibility of a more active storm track as it does so. So we have this pattern in place, and then things begin to back up a bit, right? And that allows our ridge to amplify a bit while still maintaining that flow and this moisture here in the monsoon area. So let's go and look at the precipitation forecast during this time frame. We'll zoom into the United States and let's look at moisture. Before we look at what the model does with precipitation, let's look at the moisture. And here's your answer. Because we move into the first week of July, this is not a dry pattern, folks. The synoptics we just looked at tell us that. But then this moisture forecast verifies it. We have anomalous moisture in this region, and if we know that we have a ridge sitting in this general area, right, moving the air up this way around it, that's going to take this moisture that's sitting here in the four corners and it's going to put it right into the central United States. And as we get disturbances coming over the top of that down from the Pacific, these individual frontal boundaries, they're just going to pick up on this moisture and move it into parts of the agriculture belt here. And that's that moisture signal moving into the first week of July now. And it's very clear, right? It moves right into a lot of key areas. And we've seen forecast models start to pick up on this. This is not a surprise. It should not be a surprise. We've talked about it for several days. And this moisture will get into the central U.S. here during the first week of July. Now, that being said, let's go look at what the model actually shows from a precipitation standpoint during this time frame. And lo and behold, the signal makes sense, right? We have the monsoon moisture. We have additional moisture coming from the Canadian prairies. And we get the flow and the lift to get precipitation here in a lot of the agriculture belt during the first week of July. The area that is left high and dry, and the area that will continue to be a concern, is here across the southern plains and parts of the deep south. Because eventually, as that ridging begins to build and amplify, you're going to dry this area out, and you're going to take the moisture and advect it north away from that area. So this is an area I want to keep a close eye on as we move into the next couple of weeks. But as we move into the first week of July, this moisture, this flow down into the parts of the agriculture belt, this is all good. This is moisture that is likely going to be very beneficial for a lot of key areas as this ridging begins to amplify. You'll notice too, we mentioned the EPO, right? That negative EPO. Notice how the models are taking their time with rising the EPO back to positive levels. The ensemble through the first week of July is still generally below normal with the EPO. And that tells me, if we go back and look at the heights across the hemisphere, tells me that the models are not really getting rid of this feature immediately. And that could keep a more active flow in here and sort of make this ridge, give it a tough time expanding. There's going to be some resistance on the northern side here. And that's going to be a really, really important feature. So as we move past the first week of July, the question is going to become, we know we have this active pattern in place, right? So here's our first shot of moisture. Then we get our next shot of moisture with this next sequence. And you'll notice that this is further north, right? Now our first shot was down here. The next one is up here. My question is, what happens in the middle of July, the next shot of moisture after that? Because if that next bout of storms, that next storm cluster risk is up here in Canada, that would mean that a lot of this area here in the belt is going to be drier. If it's in this general region, then I think we'll be okay. And that's going to be, I mean, as we head towards the middle part of July, that's going to be a major, major question that we have to ask. If we look at the European model and we run through the 72-hour precipitation, we can see these individual clusters and try to figure out the story the model is telling us. So here's the next several days, and you'll notice it's drier, right? We talked about that. Moving things forward, here's our moisture surge through the first week of July. You could see it very clearly, right? It's even a little drier here in the northern plains and parts of the Great Lakes. But here's our first moisture surge. It's very clear. It's not hard to pick this out. It's right here. You watch that dissipate, and here's our next moisture surge. This is valid through the 7th. So we get another one up here, aided by a disturbance coming down from the Pacific. And this one is a bit further north. So you're starting to dry out down here because this surge of moisture is further north than the last one. And then where does the next one end up? If you look, read between the lines here, the European ensemble is telling you it might be up here. Or it could be down here. There's a very large spread as to where this moisture is going to be. I can tell you one thing. The storm cluster is not going to encompass the areas from Iowa up to Saskatchewan. It's going to be either here or here. This is the ensemble telling you there's a large spread as to where this next one is going to be. So what's causing that discrepancy, right? What's the difference among the models? And the answer lies in the amplification of the ridge. So when we look at the ridge forecast, as we move towards the middle of the month, you'll see that the European ensemble now, and this is, let me pull up the most recent run here. You'll see that the European ensemble is right on that periphery, right? So here's the ridge building. This is when we get our first shot of moisture out of the monsoon into the central U.S. Here's when we get our next one. It comes up into the northern plains. This is valid through about the 8th of July. And then the model is split as to how amplified this ridge gets. And that's going to be the key determining factor, because the disturbances that come out of the Pacific and over the top of this ridge, depending on where this ridge is and how amplified it is, that will determine whether those storm clusters are here in parts of the ag belt, or if this ridge amplifies a little more, just a couple hundred miles, they could be too far north, and that could leave a lot of this area high and dry. If we go back and look at some of the analogs that we have, I pulled up some of the drier years on record in July across the ag belt. And you'll notice, first of all, that it's not too dissimilar to what we're seeing on models. We have that general Gulf of Alaska trough. We have the ridge building here with a center in the Four Corners region. And we have a secondary trough here in the eastern U.S. And so the 588 line, just for example, runs right here through the Central Plains and down through the Ohio Valley, that 588. And here's the 580 height at 500 millibars, runs right through Minnesota. So if we go back here and we look at the charts and we look at what the model is suggesting here during this time frame, we see the 588 contour is taking a similar path on the EPS here as we move towards the middle part of July, and the 580 is also taking a similar path as we move through the middle part of July. So I think what this is telling us here is that there is at least some risk as we move towards the middle part of July that the moisture flow, we have this initial shot during the first week of July, then we're going to have this next moisture shot that comes up through the northern plains and parts of the Ohio Valley. But what the model is telling us is that as we move towards this middle part of July, it's distinctly possible that the ridging itself could begin to expand across the central plains, which would deflect the moisture further north. It's not set in stone. There's quite a bit of uncertainty because it's also distinctly possible that this ridging ends up far enough south and west that these storm complexes can come over the top and drop in here to the Ohio Valley region. That being said, there are some areas of greater concern, and I want to lay those out for you as we move through the next couple of days and weeks. And really, the area that begins to become concerning the earliest for me is, and I've mentioned this several times here, is the deep south region here, from really the southern plains into the deep south, and parts of Dixie Alley. The moisture flow is over the top of this region generally, and this area has been dry already. So has parts of the Tennessee, Kentucky River Valley, and really it's going to be close as to whether or not this creeps into parts of Illinois and Indiana over the next couple of weeks. This moisture surge, which comes down here through the first week of July, it's going to be very important to verify the southern end of it specifically, because further north, in areas such as Iowa, northern Illinois, northern Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they're going to have the benefit of multiple storm clusters. But the idea here is that this southern edge of this is going to get one shot at getting some good moisture before it begins to lift away from the region as we move towards the middle part of July. And so this is the main concern area here moving forward, is the area that's on the periphery of this ridge. And this is where you can draw pretty much where the periphery of that ridge is going to be. And it's this area that I have a little bit of concern about and building concern as we move through mid-month. So again, let's just run through the highlights one more time. We know we have this period of drier weather coming up over the next couple of days through this week. Cooler and drier northwest flow coming down from that negative EPO ridge in Alaska. We know that ridge is going to gradually begin to collapse, and we know that the monsoon moisture is going to kick in. So that's going to give us a period of activity here over the top of this. We're going to get one surge through the central plains and into parts of the Ohio Valley and Midwest during the first week of July. We'll get a second complex after that that's likely to come a bit further north, and you'll notice this ridging expanding further north. And then the uncertainty increases dramatically by mid-July as to whether the next complex ends up in the Canadian prairies and further north, or if it's far enough south to still impact key parts of the ag belt. And that's going to be a key forecast moving forward into mid-July that we need to pay very close attention to, is how far north this ridge gets. The current feeling is that we are okay. There is quite a bit of risk in mid-July, but for the next couple of weeks, we have several opportunities for moisture on the periphery of these ridges, and that should provide a bit of a cushion for us as we move into this critical mid-July period with this moisture coming over the top into the central ag belt. We will have a lot more for you as we move through the next couple of days. Obviously, we're right here with you. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to guide you through this forecast as we move towards this mid-month period that will feature moisture chances, but increasing warmth across the ag belt. And then obviously as we move into the middle part of July, that increasing concern about where that moisture ends up and whether or not it moves far enough north to get out of the agriculture regions here during the middle of the month of July. So reach out to us if you have any questions. If not, I hope you all have a wonderful Monday. We'll talk to you very soon. Take care.